What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and I am recovering from the flu, so you're gonna have to pardon me being a little bit nasally. Yeah, it sucks. I'm pretty congested. But in any event, so we are covering the story where Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man kills all the villains in Marvel Comics, or kills all his villains. Technically, it's not Andrew Garfield, but I feel like it would be Andrew Garfield. Like, I don't know about you guys. From time to time, I like to take characters from the Marvel Cinematic Universe and like put them in the comics, right? Like put their faces to characters in the comics and just kind of go from there. And we know we're getting Amazing Spider-Man 3. It's probably going to be dark. So it would be awesome if it was this story. So we're going to pretend that it's Andrew Garfield Spider-Man. Just do this with me and then let me know how you feel about it at the end. I feel like you'll like it. So what this does, this initial issue anyway, is this picks up basically with Spider-Man getting the Venom symbiote in the aftermath of Secret Wars. Now, a little bit of history here for those of you guys who aren't familiar with this, right? So we've talked about this multiple times, so we're not going to go super in-depth into this, but the long and short of it is that in Marvel Comics, when they did Secret Wars in 1984, Peter Parker got what was in effect the Venom symbiote. We just simply didn't know what it was. And it wasn't until he got back to Earth that we basically learned the whole thing was essentially a living organism. So what this does is it basically opens up seemingly immediately after Secret Wars when he gets back to Earth. And that's why a lot of the characters that you're going to see in this comic are going to look the way they did back in the 1980s, because that's basically when this comic takes place. And so Peter Parker waking up really from these nightmares that he initially had, which is also kind of this idea that he's being tormented by quote unquote his best. The fact that like his best isn't necessarily good enough, right? That Uncle Ben died, that Gwen Stacy died, things like that. And that even though he's tried his best, it's led to the death of people that he cares about. That what it does is it kind of weighs on him. And so the symbiote ultimately bonds itself to Peter, and then Peter using the symbiote basically goes out into the world. Now this is really Peter Parker experimenting with it and seeing what it was capable of when he was using it as a superhero on Earth. And so what he ends up doing is coming across a guy who's basically trying to mug an older lady, and then of course, you know, kind of pummels him a little bit as you normally do when you're Spider-Man, and then webbed him up, and then essentially left, right? Not a whole lot doing there. Where things begin to get dark is when the symbiote kind of communicates with him and talks to him while he sleeps, almost feeding him these nightmares. And then when Mary Jane Watson tries to wake him up, he actually smacks her into a wall and then almost hurts her, right? And kind of does to a degree, nothing serious, but enough to where what's happening with Peter regarding the symbiote is beginning to concern Mary Jane Watson, right? That he's basically unraveling as far as she can tell, right? That he's kind of falling apart. This symbiote is having an effect on him. Now, the first real instance of us seeing him really falling to his darker side comes when he runs into Roderick Kingsley. Now, in Marvel Comics at the time, Roderick Kingsley was the Hobgoblin. Hobgoblin was kind of like the Green Goblin-esque scenario, just sort of a follow-up to the popularity of the Green Goblin. In his own right, Hobgoblin was every bit as interesting as the Green Goblin was. Was he on the same level? No. I mean, he was not the same kind of threat that Green Goblin was. He certainly didn't have the same kind of significant impact on the life of Peter Parker that Green Goblin had, but he still is a credible and dangerous threat. And so as the fight breaks out between the two of them, what Roderick Kingsley's doing here is not outside the realm of normality in terms of how he fights, right? Just not caring about anybody caught in collateral damage, and Peter Parker trying to save people where he can, right? It's kind of the dance that villains and heroes do. The difference about this is that Peter begins to get the upper hand on Hobgoblin, and instead of just like grabbing him and carting him off to the cops and calling it a day, he's basically like, I'm tired of you, right? Like, I'm tired of this back and forth game that we've been doing. And he basically rips his mask off, which is something that he's just not really supposed to do. It's kind of violating the sort of unwritten rule of the hero and villain dichotomy, realizing that it's Roderick Kingsley, and then saying like, if you keep this up, I'm not going to send you to prison. You are doing nothing more than solidifying to me that you as villains cannot be redeemed. So if you keep on with your villainous ways, I will end your life. And then just leaves, right? Just like takes off. And so following that, you do get a couple things that are sort of interesting here. Most notably, in the early days when you had Felicia Hardy, who was introduced in Marvel Comics as Black Cat, there was a lot of flirtation going on there, right? Like relationships and all that kind of stuff. And one of the things that gets hit on here is that Peter Parker actually cheats on Mary Jane Watson with Felicia Hardy. Now, this is huge. And the reason why is because while Mary Jane Watson, by this point in Peter Parker's life, had not reached the level of the love of his life in the way Gwen Stacy had, that they were in a relationship. And Peter was never really the one to cheat on the girl that he was with, right? It was just this kind of rule of Peter Parker and really just superheroes in general. You don't really step out on the person that you're dating. This is designed to kind of illustrate that Peter's fallen pretty hard pretty fast, right? Now here's a crazy thing. It's only the tip of the iceberg, because at that point you switch over to Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four. Now this also happened in the main Marvel universe, right? That when Peter was experiencing these kind of nightmares and things like that, that things seemed off, right? That he would basically wake up and it was obvious he had been out in the world despite the fact that he'd been asleep, that the symbiote seemed to have been the one that caused it. That when he went to visit Reed Richards, things happen almost exactly like they do here, albeit the situation or some of the things that take place are a little bit different, but the experimentation on Peter, analyzing the symbiote, different things like that, coming to this realization that the symbiote is a living organism. Now, while this takes place, Peter has a kind of conversation with the symbiote itself, where it shows him these almost tormenting experiences, right? Where it's like, you could help all these people, Peter. You could help all these innocent people, your Aunt May, these people that are still in your life, although you've lost Gwen Stacy, Uncle Ben, things like that. You can help them, and it's okay to hurt people to save people. You know that sometimes the only way to stop a threat is to eliminate the threat once and for all. And where Peter is reluctant to it, ultimately the symbiote seems to get the upper hand on him and is like, no, Peter, you have to be strong. Now remember, Peter still has a measure of control here, and he ultimately ends up waking up, and that's when Reed Richards tells him, this thing's alive, man. It's a sentient being, right? Like this thing that's on your body, it's a living organism, and it's feeding on your thoughts, and you're feeding on its thoughts, right? It is really more of a symbiotic relationship, not necessarily parasitic, but if you keep it long enough, it will control you. And where Reed tries to basically find a way to tell Peter to take it off, right? Where Peter goes to leave, that Peter doesn't really attack him so much as just kind of initiate a show of force by just kind of, grabbing the hand of Reed and just being like, that's not going to happen. And so once Peter leaves and he heads back home to Aunt May, that the Hobgoblin, Roderick Kingsley, is actually watching him. And so as he's there with Aunt May, his spider sense goes off and Roderick Kingsley attacks. And this is when it all takes off. Because at that point, with everything going on, right, Roderick Kingsley kind of says like, you started this, Peter, right? You struck first, threatening me, unmasking me, telling me you were going to kill me if I continued my villainous career, right? That's not how this works. You escalated and I matched in kind. And so when all this happens, there's actually an explosion that takes place in the house of Aunt May. The whole place catches fire, but because symbiotes are weak to fire, the symbiote will not let Peter Parker into the house, and ultimately Aunt May dies. And when that happens, Peter loses it. He absolutely goes off, right? And then turns all the frustration and anger he has towards Roderick Kingsley. That where Roderick is kind of walking away and was like, okay, this was obviously a mistake to push Spider-Man like this, that basically he gets webbed up. And then in turn, Peter's just like, you started this, Roderick Kingsley, but I will finish it, right? Like you cannot be fixed. Like you literally came here to my house and attacked my family and got my Aunt May killed. I have the power to end you. I have the power to stop everything that you're doing. And with great power must also come great responsibility. And he undertakes the responsibility of ending Roderick Kingsley, of killing him. Like literally, he crushes his skull and leaves him for dead. Like it's not like he hides the body or anything. It's not like he keeps it hidden or anything like that. Like literally just leaves him, right? Just leaves him attached to a light post and just walks away. So everybody knows that it was Spider-Man who did it. And so what you get at that point is you get this whole kind of discussion between Peter and Venom, that where Peter initially resisted, where Peter initially was like, no, we can't take this darker path, that because of the fact that it's really been a kind of emotional war of attrition, right? That the Venom symbiote's just kind of been weighing on him and weighing on him and weighing on him, right? Pushing him over and over and over again. That combined with the circumstances that just took place, Peter's at his weakest. And that's when it basically talks him into this idea that he basically put an end to Hobgoblin because it's what needed to be done. That the only way to stop criminals is to kill criminals. Because if those criminals could revert or could leave that life of crime, they would have. They choose to be criminals. They desire to be criminals. And as long as there's no real consequences for the things they do, they will continue to be criminals. And that in this kind of situation, criminals inflict violence. Therefore, the only way to make a criminal understand is to speak a language they understand, which is to meet violence with violence, right? To destroy them. It's why I always say violence is not always the answer, but it is a answer, and it's usually a very effective one. And so following that, of course, the Daily Bugle immediately figures out what's going on with Hobgoblin, right? Roderick Kingsley killed, and they're publishing it all over the place, right? They're just like, is Spider-Man a threat or a murderer, right? That kind of a thing. And so while that's happening, and Peter's kind of coming to terms with the fact that the Daily Bugle is basically painting him as a killer, which he essentially is, you switch over to the Kingpin. And the crazy thing about this is that Kingpin, looking at all this unfold, is like, okay, so yes, we've basically figured out that it was Spider-Man who killed Hobgoblin. Well, now Spider-Man's basically taken this step to where he's killing villains. We don't know under what circumstances he's doing it. We simply just know that he is. And Kingpin, ever the pragmatist, looks around and says, okay, so I'm literally the Kingpin of crime. I've got my hand in everything, right? Like my criminal empire cannot handle my death. Therefore, I am not willing to die. So we're gonna make some calls and we're gonna get rid of Spider-Man. And so what you do is you switch over to the Daily Bugle, and one of the more interesting moments where J. Jonah Jameson is always being J. Jonah Jameson, right? Just kind of being a dick, but it's all about creating these articles, you know, publishing Spider-Man as basically a killer. When Spider-Man shows up and then basically tells him, if you keep on publishing this, I'm gonna kill you, breaks his hand and then leaves, like literally threatens the press, right? It's pretty insane. And so obviously this is drawing the attention of everybody, right? Not even just supervillains, it's drawing the attention of superheroes, right? Spider-Man's going rogue and Spider-Man's killing people. And so because of this, you actually end up switching to him first, being attacked by the Shocker, not Electro, right? The Shocker's a poor man's version of Electro, but basically being attacked by the Shocker. But because Shocker is what he considers to be some kind of second-rate thief, right? A low-level guy, there's no way he'd make a move on Peter by himself. And that makes sense. The only time you ever really saw the Shocker doing something like this, right? Making a move on Peter, is if he was part of a larger group where he believed he could get the upper hand. But Peter, realizing something else is going on, comes to this realization the Scorpion's there as well. And so he ends this like that. Like he literally uses his symbiote to overcome the Scorpion and basically kill him. And then in turn attacks Shocker and then kills Shocker. Shows up on the doorstep of Kingpin and then throws the severed arm of the Shocker on the floor, and then basically throws the pieces of Scorpion on the floor as well. And then where he goes through and says, okay, so like we've been researching you, right? Like, you know, when you murdered Hobgoblin, I had my men research the woman who died in the fire, May Parker. To provoke such a reaction, she must have been someone close to you. Our best match was a man named Peter Parker, you. So I went about investigating, seeing if you had any other close family members, a wife, a girlfriend, someone I could threaten, but there was no one. So incredibly sad. You have no one, Peter Parker. Anyone you've ever loved is dead. And then in turn, he kills Kingpin, just like that. Like, it's the ruthlessness of Peter Parker, like literally just killing people, just on a whim, right? Just killing people. And so at that point, it breaks down to the Sinister Six, right? You literally get Dr. Octopus, Mysterio, Kraven the Hunter, Rhino, Electro. You get this team assembled, and they're like, okay, so the death of the Hobgoblin is really what brings in Otto Octavius, right? Because at that point, now we're getting into upper echelons, right? I mean, it's one thing to kill the Shocker, it's one thing to kill Scorpion, whatever, but when the Kingpin is killed, a guy who is, by all standards of measurement, untouchable, then now they know Peter means business, right? And so that's why Octavius says, like, the death of Hobgoblin, Fist sent Shocker and Scorpion after him, and now, well, they're all dead, and we're next. So this isn't really necessarily the Sinister Six taking on any kind of a superhero role. It's really an act of survival. Like, they look at the actions of Peter, and they look at their role as villains, and it's like, Peter's gonna come after us. It's only a matter of time before he does. And it doesn't even have to be because we're villains, right? We could just stop being villains right now and just walk away, right? But it could be any number of the things that we've done before, because, you know, from their perspective, Peter's lost his mind. I mean, they don't know he's Peter, right? Like, you know, they know Spider-Man's lost his mind, but they're like, we don't know why he would attack us, right? It could be because he views us as people that were previously villains, and even though we've hung up our spurs and we're not villains anymore, we could go back to a life of crime, and that's just not a threat he wants to deal with, so he just kills us so he doesn't have to worry about it. But the other part of this is that they've actually been brought together and unified by J. Jonah Jameson, who's like, he has to be stopped, right? Like, I've tried to warn people for years, Spider-Man is a menace, nobody wanted to believe me, and now he's killing people, right? Now people are believing me. And so in turn, the response of Otto is, okay, yes, like, it's time for us to do something, we have to put our plan in motion. And so at that point, it's a matter of trying to find who it is, or at least where they can lure Spider-Man, right? What kind of trap they can set to bring Spider-Man to basically their best location to where they could take him out, right? Standard Sinister Six stuff. Only for us to find out that one of the henchmen who's there, a guy by the name of Terrence, kills Dr. Octopus, right? Stabs this guy in the back, seemingly out of nowhere, unmasks himself, and reveals that he's Eddie Brock. And he's like, no, right? I have my grudge with Peter Parker. If anybody's going to kill Spider-Man, it's gonna be me, right? Like, I'm gonna be the one to kill him, which is kind of crazy because following that, instead of Eddie Brock becoming Venom as we normally expect, instead what he does is he basically takes the tentacles of Dr. Octopus and then becomes like Eddie, you know, Doc Brock, I think is what they call him, right? Becomes becomes like Eddie Brock, Dr. Octopus, which is kind of cool. It's something that we've never really seen before, and I like that idea. The more I see different writers like Chip Zdarsky take these traditional roles that belong to like heroes and villains and then give them to somebody else, the more I like it, man. It makes you think of the possibilities, right? I mean, if everything just stayed the same forever, it'd be boring as hell, right? Like, it's cool to see different characters playing these roles. And so the result of this is that bringing the entire team together, right? Even though you have Otto Octavius, who was killed by Brock, they're like, okay, I mean, whatever, you know, let's kind of bring this guy on board. You've got a pretty solid team here, right? I mean, like this group, and it's easy to overlook the power of the Sinister Six, right? But you've got like Mysterio, you got Electro, you got Rhino, you got Kraven. You've got some pretty heavy hitters here. These guys, under normal circumstances, would be more than enough to take out Spider-Man. And so that's the crazy thing, is that once Spider-Man arrives on the scene, Mysterio immediately initiates his illusions, and then tells everybody, keep your devices on, right? So that you guys can essentially see the real world, and Peter will be the only one who'll be caught up in the illusion that I'm creating. But the crazy thing about this is that Peter is able to decipher pretty fast that there's an illusion created here by Mysterio, and actually moving underground, which is a pretty cool concept, like literally traveling underground. And because of the fact that they can't locate him, they can't see where he is, they figure out like he's gone underground. He immediately comes up, kills Mysterio, right? As soon as Mysterio's dead, right? It's the death of the queen on the chessboard, right? At that point, if you don't know what you're doing, the game is over. And these guys don't know what they're doing, and so the game is over. This fight is one of the quickest ass whoopings that you're ever gonna see in the history of comics. It goes by so fast. Like Rhino charges, bam, gets punched, right? Eddie Brock goes after him, Eddie Brock gets incapacitated, right? He doesn't get killed, he just gets knocked the heck out. You immediately have Electro who goes to attack Peter, and Electro's killed, right? Like these guys are just killed so fast, so quick. So you ultimately end up having J. Jonah Jameson, who shows up in a kind of mechanized suit. And because of the fact that the actions of Electro had sparked a fire before his death, the net of Kraven actually ensnares Peter, so he simply just can't escape. And ultimately, the symbiote seems to succumb to the fire, right? Basically seems to end up burning alive. And so following that, J. Jonah Jameson is one, surprised to learn that it's Peter Parker, which is a kind of a shock to him, right? Like it's almost a disappointment that it turned out to be Peter. And two, Kraven's knocked unconscious. And so at that point, everybody except for J. Jonah Jameson, Eddie Brock, and Kraven the Hunter have all been killed by Peter. Up to this point, 11 people have been killed by Peter Parker as Spider-Man. 11 villains, all killed by Peter Parker ruthlessly and with no remorse whatsoever. The funny thing about this, and as you would expect, right, the day's saved, they ride off into the sunset in order to, you know, bring Peter Parker to terms for everything he's done. Of course, the symbiote, or at least a portion of it, remains in the back of the van, and that's when everything begins to pop off, is because you end up coming to this realization that in the aftermath of Wilson Fisk's death, that a kind of doomsday situation or doomsday scenario that he had initiated is that Peter Parker's identity is let out into the world. And so everybody realizes Peter Parker Spider-Man, i.e. Peter Parker had killed all these villains. The other part of this is that with the symbiote that had essentially been taken by Reed and examined, that what had happened is that the symbiote itself had actually escaped and then bonded itself not only to Reed Richards, but has also taken over Ben Grimm the Thing, right? So at this point, now it's weaponized itself. And so following that, like literally, it starts taking over all these people. And before anybody really has any understanding of like what it is that they're supposed to do, the entire Baxter building has essentially been taken over. So there's no real time to like prosecute Peter, hand him to the feds. And even if there was, it's like, okay, but like we'll do that after this because there's far more important things going on here. And so you essentially have a full coming together of the Avengers and the X-Men as they existed at that point in time, right? That's why Iron Man looks the way he does. That's why the X-Men, it's really more X-Factor than the X-Men or anything else. She-Hulk hasn't changed in decades, which is one of the reasons why nobody cares about her character. But the important thing about this is that it's kind of the old school roster of the Avengers and X-Factor, kind of the original X-Men on a new team coming together in an effort to like find a way to basically end this. Now, the funny thing about this is that the symbiote operating with the intelligence of Reed Richards means it knows all the strengths and all the weaknesses of the Venom symbiote. And so what that does is it allows the Venom symbiote to literally find ways, or at least use the technology of Reed to protect itself. And so where you have Spider-Man and you have Johnny Storm, who make their way into the building along with Mary Jane Watson, which I don't even know what she was going to do. They basically find out the symbiote's taken over everybody in the building, right? So literally they're walking into what's basically a death trap. Not only that, you've got Ben Grimm the Thing, who's a guy that's on par with the Incredible Hulk in his base form. So obviously this guy's a heavy hitter, so he's not easily defeated. And in fact, Peter does everything he can against this guy. Even says like, I'm angry, and when I'm angry, I'm unstoppable. No quips, no pulling punches. Ben can take it, right? And just starts to pummel Ben as best he can. But at the end of the day, Peter Parker is still not 100% after everything that's happened, and Ben Grimm's able to get the upper hand. Now, the idea of Ben Grimm fighting Peter is, if anything, really more of a distraction. But where Ben Grimm is knocked out of the building and then basically met by all the other Avengers, and they're like, we're here to help, then ultimately they're all taken over by the symbiote. So now you've basically got X-Factor and the Avengers, who have all basically been conquered by the symbiote itself. That only Johnny Storm and Peter Parker are really the last ones left. On top of that, with the Venom symbiote controlling Reed and the technology at his disposal, now Peter and Johnny Storm have to contend with all of them. And so at that point, it's an act of desperation. And in fact, you see something that you don't really see very often, which is Peter running and hiding. Now keep in mind, it's not Peter being a coward. He's not like, oh my God, like we're so screwed, and then just runs and hides. But it's one of those things where the actions of Peter is to really kind of keep himself momentarily hidden away so he can kind of gather himself and figure out what their next step needs to be. Of course, it also gives Johnny Storm a chance to get Mary Jane Watson out of there, right? Because the last thing Peter needs is for Mary Jane Watson to die. And so at that point, it comes down to Peter and it comes down to Johnny Storm to figure out what their next step is going to be. Now, on the outside, you also get another distraction in the form of Susan Storm, right? The Invisible Woman. She creates force fields, things like that. She's there to kind of distract the other heroes that are basically taken over by the symbiotes to make sure that they don't really get in the way of what it is that Peter's trying to do. And also just trying to fight off things as best she can, right? It's just, you know, superheroes doing superhero things. And so ultimately you end up having Peter Parker coming to this realization that because of the fact that the symbiote had taken over Reed Richards and then in turn had used itself to bond itself to other members out there, that by taking out the symbiote as it's bonded to Reed would be like driving a dagger through or driving a stake through the heart of a vampire. It would kill the subservient vampires that have been created by that initial vampire. And so essentially defeating the symbiote as it's bonded to Reed will basically free everybody else. But it's no small feat because a symbiote won't simply just leave. And because of the fact that it's aware of all its weaknesses and the various things that all these heroes could do to try to overcome its weaknesses, things like fire, things like Sonics will not readily work. And so what they need is some kind of another plan. And so what you get is a plan that's kind of concocted between Peter and Johnny Storm, which is pretty genius, right? The way this works is that Peter says, okay, so in order to overcome this symbiote, I'm gonna have to get this symbiote to leave Reed Richards and to bond itself to me. And everything that symbiote's doing is to try to convince me that it's right, that its way of doing things is the right way of doing things. And so because of that, he's like, the symbiote basically wants to return to me, right? That's essentially what it is. That if you could call it love, that's what the symbiote feels. And so the response of Peter, once he shows up and actually starts talking to the symbiote, is, okay, look, I know that at the root of what you feel is some twisted version of love, and you could just take me over, like that much I know. Like I'm standing here and you could just use your abilities and just take me in as some kind of a servant of yourself. But how satisfying would that be, right? Forcing me to merge with you. If you let Mary Jane live, if you stop possessing the other heroes, then I'll give myself over willingly. And the response of the symbiote is, okay, we can do that. The problem is this guy Reed is too smart, right? This guy will find a way to destroy me while I've basically possessed you. We can't let him live. And the symbiote kills Reed, right? Just kills Reed Richards right on the spot. And in that moment, Peter Parker takes off back into the Baxter building, right? Mad as hell, takes off back into the Baxter building and then runs as fast as it possibly can. And so what you end up getting is a symbiote, of course, chasing after him and then getting him down into a corner. And that's where you end up finding out the trap that was set is that Peter Parker got his hands on an image inducer. And the image inducer was given to Johnny Storm to make Johnny Storm look like Peter Parker. This is not Peter, this is Johnny Storm. When the symbiote immediately seizes Peter and then encases itself around Peter Parker, Johnny Storm reveals the ruse and then it's just like flame on, right? And then just torches this thing on the spot. I gotta say, it's the most creative way to kill a symbiote that I have ever seen. It is so cool. I never saw this coming, right? I mean, the story itself was a little, but the idea of the way in which they killed the symbiote, right? The way that Chip Zdarsky came up with this, which is to like trick the symbiote into believing that it's actually Peter instead of Johnny Storm. Storm was pretty cool. One of the big issues that you have with this, and those of you guys who are experienced with the Venom symbiote will probably have spotted this right off the bat, that the symbiote, when it was bonded to Peter, shared almost something like a sixth sense, right? Almost a sense in and of itself, to where it would have known right off the bat that that's not Peter, right? Unless the image inducer was so advanced that it would have tricked the senses of the symbiote, which there doesn't seem to be an indication that was the case. And so with that being the case, that ultimately this symbiote's basically destroyed, right? It's totally eradicated. And so following that, of course, everybody just kind of mourns Reed, the fact that Reed's basically dead. And then in turn, Peter ends up going to trial. Now, the crazy thing about this is that with Peter being on trial, the fact that like Captain America and these other individuals out there basically testifying to the fact that when they were possessed by the symbiote, they couldn't control themselves, right? They didn't have the ability to stop themselves from doing the things that the symbiote was making them do, that it basically created the case that Peter being possessed by the symbiote, that it wasn't really Peter, it was the symbiote, right? So Peter is an innocent person. Like by all standards of measurement, it would have been no different if somebody had used mind control and took over the body of Peter and then made Peter do things, right? The funny thing about this, and this is the part that Peter kind of keeps to himself, and is something that he doesn't even reveal to MJ, is that he willingly gave in to the symbiote. He knew what was going to happen when he was possessed by the symbiote, but he and the symbiote shared a similar mind. It's his dark secret. He doesn't tell anybody. And so the funny thing is that the story effectively ends with basically Peter being approached by Susan Storm and then being told, look, with everything that's happened, right? Reed's death was not your fault. None of us are strangers to tragedy. I know you aren't, right? One of our first tragedies was that rocket flight that gave us all powers, you know, that turned Ben Grimm into the Thing and all that kind of stuff, right? Nobody knows this, but Reed almost died from the guilt of that. But instead of succumbing, he did something remarkable. He took that tragedy, that guilt, and turned it into something good. He helped Ben, helped all of us become heroes. And that's when she approaches them and says, we want you to not necessarily replace Reed Richards, but to step in and take this tragedy that you've experienced and turn it into something that you can build, right? Become a part of the Fantastic Four and become a part of this grander superhero community, this sort of a step above, you know, where you were. It's a pretty ironic set of circumstances. Peter gives in to the symbiote, knowing that the symbiote is going to basically begin a path of death and destruction because Peter actually wants it, right? And then in turn, a massive conflict ensues. Keeping this entire secret to himself, he's now effectively rewarded for his actions. It's pretty wild. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. Let me know what you guys think about this story down in the comment section. I'm really curious. I've seen pretty divisive reviews on it. Some people loved it, some people didn't really like it at all. But let me know what you guys think. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.